the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to go to the Google Classroom, and I'm going to share my screen so everyone can be on the same page. So this is a Google Classroom. If you decide to make a Google Classroom, it's very easy. You can do it for free. It has some advantages, and you can design one for your lesson. You don't have to, but we'll go through some reasons why having a Google Classroom might be beneficial when you're designing your lesson. So if you've never worked with Google Classroom before, you have sort of this stream page on the front where you can post announcements. And then if you click over to Classwork, you have the classwork for the lesson. So for this particular lesson, I have four different links. I have my Google slide link, I've got this article link, I've got some Digimorph links. So if you have a lot of materials that you're going to need for your lesson, a lot of different links, a lot of different sites that you're going to be working with, Google Classroom can be very helpful because it puts everything into one space for your students. And so therefore you can just tell everybody, okay, click on this link, and then it pulls it up for everyone. The other thing that can be really beneficial with Google Classroom is that for this particular lesson, I have a class set of everything, and we'll talk about why. But when you design your materials, so if you go into assignments, you can actually, when you're adding materials, so let's say I want to add, I'll just randomly add something here, whatever pops up first. Sorry, it's loading. So let's say I want to add this ByteForce Google Doc, okay? So I insert that. I can select it so that we have a class copy, and I can also select it that it will make a copy for each student. So instead of having to make a separate copy for every single student who's going to be in your room, you can actually have Google Doc do that work for you. So that can be kind of nice as well. Google Classroom do that work for you. And then adding students is very easy. You can just add them with by sending them the link or typing in their email address. So pretty easy, pretty user-friendly, and you'll see how I kind of use it for today's lesson. Again, you don't have to, but it's a good resource to have. Okay, so what we're going to do first is I want you to click that ByteForce demo lesson, the Google slide. We're going to be working on that together. It should look like this. You can have a teacher version and a student version. For this demonstration, I just have the teacher version, which everybody's going to be using. Okay, so today's lesson, like I said, is going to be on ByteForce because it has a little bit of everything for our participants today. And for my engage, I'm going to start off with talking about Jurassic Park. Thank you, Brianda. She totally wore the shirt today for that because she knew. So in Jurassic Park, there's a scene where the Tyrannosaurus Rex is chasing down the Jeep, flips over the Jeep, and starts basically tearing into the Jeep. So it's pulling out pieces of the Jeep as it's trying to get to the people inside to eat them. Who here has seen that scene, seen Jurassic Park? You can give me a little, show me your hands, you can give me the little reaction, you know, if you've seen that. All right, exactly. Okay, so we've seen that scene. Now, if I was actually doing this with my students as an engage, I could actually show that scene to my students to make sure that everybody's on the same page. I'm not going to do that right now because we got a lot of cover and I want to make sure we finish within an hour. But I could show that as part of my engage. So we have this scene, Tyrannosaurus Rex digging into the Jeep, biting it, tearing it apart. So here's my question for you. And I want you to type it into the chat. If you don't know where the chat is, you can select the chat button. It's either going to be at the bottom of your screen, or if you're in full screen mode, it will probably be under the top. If you don't see it, click the three buttons that say more, and it should have a drop-down menu, and the chat should be there. So in the chat, what I want you to type is, do you think this is possible? Do you think a Tyrannosaurus Rex could tear open a Jeep? Do you think it has a strong enough bite force to tear through a Jeep? Type into the chat what you think. Okay, so everybody's like, yeah, I think it could do it. I think it could totally do it. Well, Let's find out if you're right. Oh, especially the new Jeeps. Are they a little thinner? I think this is a Jeep from the 90s, so I don't know. Does maybe that makes an impact. So what you're going to do now is we are going to read an article that is going to answer that question. Could a T-Rex bite through a Jeep? So to get to that article, I'm going to copy and paste the link into the chat. But here's the thing. I also have it in my Google Classroom. So if I go back to my Google Classroom right here, it's this second link. And so the students can select it from the Google Classroom or they could select it from the chat. So again, you have multiple options on how you share these materials with the students. So what I want you to do here is, okay, kind of gives it away in the title, right? But what I want you to do, it's a pretty short article. I want you to read the article, and as you're reading the article, you're going to answer that question, could a T-Rex actually bite through a Jeep? And you're also going to do an AVID strategy. So you're going to do an AVID 3, 2, 1 strategy, which I'm going to type into the chat as well. And so here's the 3, 2, 1. You're going to think about 3 things that was covered in the article. So kind of what were 3 main points that were covered in the article. I want you to think of 2 questions you might have or want to know more about. And I want you to think about 1 thing that was really interesting or surprising when you're reading this article. So I'm going to type that into the chat. It's an AVID 3, 2, 1 strategy. 3 things that were covered in the article, the main 3 things from the article, 2 questions you might have or want to know more about, and 1 thing that was really interesting or surprising. Now, at this point, I could have you do it on your own. I could break you up into breakout rooms and you could discuss. Again, for the sake of time, we're going to have you do it on your own and then discuss as a class. So I will give everybody about 5 minutes to do so. So I'll keep this up on the screen for our viewers at home so they can read the article, but you can pull up your own version and read it. And then in about 5 minutes, we'll come back and we'll discuss what you thought using that 3, 2, 1 strategy. Okay, so before we go off, I will ask to make sure that we understand what we're up to. Brianda, can you please unmute yourself and tell us what are we going to be doing right now?
Yes, we're going to read the article, then we're going to follow the strategies, the 3 to 1 strategies, 2 questions we might have or want to know, or 1 thing that was really interesting or surprising to us about the article.
Absolutely. And then the 3 main things from the article. Perfect. Thank you, Brianda. All right, off you go. You can go read the article. And then, like I said, at about 3:50, we'll come back and we will discuss. Unless you're all done sooner, in which case we can do it then. Okay, so let's talk about this article a little bit. So, according to the article, what does it say? Can the T-Rex bite through the Jeep? So, Esther, what was your impression?
Yes, that it can bite through the Jeep.
And did it explain how it could do it? How could it bite
Yeah,
through the Jeep?
because it had like the rigid skull,
Mm-hmm.
so that allowed it to like with the force, or I guess so it wouldn't hurt its head.
Right, so it wouldn't like crush its own skull when it was biting down, which would be problematic. Speaking of force, how much force are we talking about? Let's go check into the article. How much force are they saying that the T-Rex would have had when it bit down, when it bit into its prey?
I think it was 7 tons, upwards of
7 tons of pressure, right? That's pretty significant. So significant that they say, yeah, this guy, he had the biggest bite force out of all land animals, extinct or extant. So of all land animals, largest bite force, which is pretty impressive. So would anyone like to share something interesting that they liked about the article or something they would like to know more about?
Okay. I read it already, and I found out that they act like scavengers and like hunters at the same time, kind of like the hyenas. So that
Excellent.
was interesting.
Yeah, so they were scavengers and hunters at the same time, like hyenas. And hold that thought, because we're going to come back to hyenas in just a little bit. They also mentioned another animal that they said the T Rex was similar to. What was that other animal that they kind of likened it to?
Was it the Salt Lake crocodile?
Right, the Salt Lake crocodile. So we're going to come back to that crocodile in just a little bit as well. Okay, so clearly the T Rex has a very powerful bite force. So now what we're going to do is the T Rex is extinct. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to look at some extant species or species that are still living. And we're going to look at their bite force and we're going to see which ones have the greatest bite force, which ones have the least bite force, and we're going to try to figure out why, if we can figure out some patterns as to why certain organisms have a larger bite force than others. So that's kind of the goal of today's lesson. So before we get to that, I'm going to pause right there. So that was my engage. And so I want us to talk about what are some strategies that I use throughout the engage that we could use in our own lessons coming up. So type into the chat, please, what were some strategies that you noticed or tools that you noticed that we used for the engage part of the lesson? Okay, so Rosanda was saying the goal is to make it interesting. That was my goal. I hope I achieved it. Get the students excited. So how did I do that? What were some things that I incorporated into my lesson to reach that goal? Okay, so comparing it to Jurassic Park, pop culture, using the video, using a known movie. Very good. The 3-2-1 AVID strategy, having the students read an article and think about something interesting. Okay, absolutely. So now I want you to also think about, so we used an article, we could use a video. Oh, illustrations. Rosendo, can you tell me a little bit what you mean by illustrations? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, like in other words, like if you use like pictures for maybe like sometimes students don't know what the teacher's talking about, right? So if you use illustrations, so it would be easier for them to like know what we're talking about,
Okay,
right?
great.
And
Yeah.
it makes it, yeah, like right now we're seeing the massive jawline of the that dinosaur, right? So we can infer that it can crush a jeep right away, right?
Absolutely right. We have the images from the article. We have the images in the PowerPoint, right? With we have the Jeep and we have the Tyrannosaurus Rex sort of biting the head off of this chicken-looking dinosaur. All right, so those are very vivid images that we're looking at right there. So I love that, and we're going to talk more about the power of images later on in the lesson and why that's going to be so important. Um, and Maritza, you mentioned discussion. Could you elaborate on that? How are we having a discussion even though we're online?
By having us, when you had us read the article by yourself and then giving us that 3-2-1, you brought us back to be able to have the discussion. And you're either how you did it where you're like picking on us randomly, or you can have just someone like raise their hand or type it in the chat like how you did, and just having us elaborate, so we're having more of a discussion. So it's including everybody and making sure that they're actually doing what they're supposed to do.
Perfect. Thank you, Maritza. So you mentioned a lot of things there. So you
Hmm.
mentioned that we're using chat, we're discussing, I'm randomly calling on students, I'm letting students volunteer, and we're using strategies to sort of goose the discussion along. I didn't just say, read the article. What do you
Yeah.
think? You know, it was
Hmm.
kind of like, read the article and think about these three things. So yeah, and Rosando and added to that in the chat. It was a system that was pretty straightforward.
Hmm.
So those are great. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to use the chat and how to use discussion in your lesson, because the chat is a very dynamic tool and there's many different ways that we can use it. And so I'm going to model a few of those ways as we move on. So this would be an example of an engage. We have a video reference, we have an article reference. You can use whatever you like for your engage. You can use demos, you can use, all sorts of stuff. Sky's the limit, but just kind of showing you a few things that you can use that we'll incorporate into the lesson to kind of get the students sort of excited about where you're going. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to move into the Explore, and I'm going to show you a bunch of different tools that you can use to actually keep your Explore interactive, even though we're going to be doing this online. So moving back to our lesson, okay, what I want everyone to do is I want everyone to look at this image, because today we're talking about bite force. So bite force, what is that? Like, I think we have to stop and say, wait, what is bite force? So if you had to guess what is bite force, what do you think it might be? Everyone think about that for a second. I'm going to call on someone. What do you think bite force is actually referring to? I'm going to give this one to Fernando. Fernando, what do you think bite force is?
Bite force could be the amount of energy or force that a skull can be able to produce using the teeth and like the muscles to like contract and like clamp down.
Okay, great. So I'm hearing things, it's either a force, maybe it's energy. We're going to talk about what bite force is measured in just a little bit. Are we measuring energy? Are we measuring force? The answer is actually a little tricky. But you mentioned that it has something to do with teeth, and this has something to do with being able to clamp down. So, this, like, we could all do this real fast, open your mouth, clamp down. That's pretty much what we're measuring there. It's how much force you can exert when you do that. Clearly, the Tyrannosaurus Rex could do quite a bit, but we're going to be looking at some other organisms as well that have this bite force. So before we get into which ones have the greatest bite force and which ones have the weakest bite force, I want you to look at this image. So I have this image here. Right here, we have a dog. So this is our dog. And here is another picture of the dog if we were going to kind of look from, upwards. And then on the other one, we have a cat. So here is our cat. Again, we're looking from the side, and then we're kind of looking as though we were underneath the cat and kind of looking up. And we have some arrows here. We have some pictures of muscles here. We have some pictures of the skull. So I'm just going to give everybody a couple seconds, and I want you to look at these two images of the dog and the cat and see if you can figure out, like, what is involved in biting. Because we think, oh, biting, that's like a pretty simple thing. But is it? I want you to look at the images and tell me in just a second, what is involved in biting? You can read that caption as well if that's helpful for you. Okay, so if you think you've figured it out or you're on the right track, you don't have to figure out the whole thing, but if you have sort of an idea, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to type it into the chat, but don't do it yet because I have a special thing I want you to do. Is I want you to change the chat from everyone. So if you look at the bottom, the chat says everyone in kind of a blue box. If you click on the arrow, it will actually give you the option to chat with different people in the class. I want you to send it to me as a private chat. So select Elizabeth Goldberg, host, and now what you can do is when you chat, only I'm going to see that information. Nobody else is going to be able to. So select private chat to Elizabeth Goldberg, and this is something you can do with your students, is you can have them public chat or private chat. And I want you to put into the private chat, what do you think's going on? Like, how does biting work? Based off these pictures, based off these illustrations, how does biting work? Okay, so I'm starting to get some responses in. You can't see them, but I can because it's private chat. Oh, we got our last one. Okay, excellent. So I'm seeing some excellent ideas about how biting works. And I'm going to go with Fernando on this one. Fernando, how do you think biting works based off these illustrations?
I think it's kind of like it's like a hinge.
Like a
It's
hinge.
like the skull opens up like through the back, and there's muscles that one goes in a downwards direction, and one goes like in an upwards direction. And so then like when it wants to clamp down, the muscles can just like snap down and create like a force.
Okay, so we've got muscles that are moving back, we've got muscles that are moving up, we've got kind of a hinge, and they are snapping, sort of snapping down. I'm seeing some head nodding going on over here. Esther, how do you feel about that? Do you like it? Is there something you want to add to it? Sort of that definition that Fernando was giving us.
Yeah, I just agree because I hadn't thought about it like that. I hadn't actually seen the arrow in the bottom. I just saw the arrows like going up. So that's why I was going like, oh, okay, I see it now.
Right. So it's not just that upward motion, it's also that counter motion in the back. Based off this illustration, would you say biting is a simple process or would you say biting is a complex process? What do we think? So I'm going to give that one to Brianda. Brianda, based off these illustrations and Fernando's sort of discussion about it, would you say biting is simple or biting is a complex process?
A complex process, because based on the pictures we can see that it takes a lot of movements and a lot of muscles from the animal or from us even
Mm-hmm.
to
Absolutely.
actually.
Yeah, so we've got muscles on the sides, we've got muscles in the back, we've got a bunch of cranial features, a lot of skull features going on. So when I first designed this lesson, I was like, oh, this will be easy. We'll have you calculate your own bite force. That's actually pretty hard to do. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some instruments they use and a little bit how they calculate bite force. But yeah, it's not as easy as you just bite down. Well, there's actually quite a bit going on to actually have you bite down, as we can see from these illustrations. So that pretty much in a nutshell is bite force. We're looking at the muscles, we're looking at the skull, and then we're measuring how much force all of that put together is going to be when it's kind of like Fernando says, when it snaps shut. Now, I'm going to pause again and let's talk about some strategies that I used in this case. So, what were some strategies that I used when we were discussing what is biting? So let me start off with Maritza. Maritza, what was a strategy I used?
I don't know if it would really be considered a strategy, but you had us looking at the images and like just had us process it ourselves before we just blurted out the answers, along with having us send you our thoughts personally instead of just everyone showing it to everyone so that others can just like repeat the same thing.
Okay, great. So Maritza, we're going to talk about each of those separately because you hit them all in one. Thank you.
Yeah.
You got them all. You got them all. All right, she's paying attention. So what we got here is we've got visuals and then we've got private chat. So let's talk about each of those independently. So let's start off with visuals. And I think Rosendo mentioned the power of visuals earlier. So I'm going to say it. And if I'm your master teacher, you're going to hear it a bunch until you get like sick of it. You're like, okay, Miss Goldberg, I get it. But you live and die by your visuals. If you have good visuals, your students will be able to figure out just about anything in an inquiry-based lesson. If you have bad visuals, it ain't gonna happen. So if your students are stuck, if they're struggling, if they're giving you a lot of wrong answers, it might be your visuals. I would first step go to your visuals. If you got good visuals, that's going to help. Now, sometimes you'll need one visual, sometimes you'll need more than one visual. Sometimes one visual isn't going to be enough. So having multiple visuals, well-selected visuals, is really going to be the key. Now, with these visuals, did I just stop with the visual that I had? What else did I do? What else did I do on top of the visual that I had?
You follow with the mouse, like kind of like guiding the students.
Right, I have these annotations. So just because you got like a super awesome visual, that's really not enough because, well, where am I looking on the visual? There's a lot going on here. So where am I looking? So also being able to annotate, adding text, adding arrows, circling as the students are explaining, focusing their thoughts, that's going to be really key. Now the cool thing is that Zoom has this annotate feature. So you can use the Zoom annotate, that's what I'm using. Your students can use the Zoom annotate. So they could be annotating. So I could say, when Fernando's talking about what's happening with bite force, I circled, but I could also have him circle. I could have the whole class circle. Where do you think the jaw is moving? And you can do that either with Zoom, or you can do that directly on the Google slide, or if you're using a PowerPoint, you can do it directly on the PowerPoint, because they do have, all of them have draw features. So whichever one you prefer. If you do it on Zoom, just a word of warning, it stays to the screen, not to the slide. So if I move to the next slide, there's all my annotations. So that means I have to erase them. So if you want to keep your annotations, use the annotation in Google Slide or in PowerPoint, it will keep it there. If you're okay with deleting the annotations, then you can just use them on Zoom. Up to you. So that's one thing, is we had some visuals, we had some text to help with the visuals, some explanation, and then I annotated the visual. Now let's talk about the second thing. The second thing we talked about was the private, oops, I did not mean to go there, was the private chat. So let's talk about the private chat. So I at first I used the public chat, now I'm using the private chat. What would be the benefit of using the private chat? Why would I want to use the private chat instead of always using the public chat? Fernando?
It could help with students that so like they don't feel like uncomfortable or feel like they're gonna made fun of if like they either give like a wrong answer, or like they don't feel like they're gonna be like what's the word, like called out for it, just like for what they're saying, and they feel like they could just write whatever and you read it, and then like no one else has to read it.
Perfect. Yeah, Fernando, that is great. So, just like your students in a normal classroom, it's intimidating to answer in front of the class. And you don't want to get it wrong. It just as intimidating to answer in a chat on Zoom. In fact, in some ways it's more intimidating because it's like there forever. Like it never goes away. Everyone can see it. So just like your students wouldn't want to necessarily shout out an answer if they're not quite sure, same thing when you're doing a virtual lesson. So private chat can be that nice little, all right, you know what? You don't have to answer in front of everybody. Just answer to me. I'm the only one who has to see it. And so that can be really great for your students who are a little bit shy, a little bit unsure. I had one student who said, I'm not 100% sure. That's fine. Nobody else has to know that. Only I know that. It's also really great, I want you to think about for your English learners. Let's say we have an English learner in our class who's not very comfortable with English. How can the private chat be very helpful for that student? What's going to be the benefit of the private chat in that situation?
So the student won't be like, if I misspell something, they'll make it laugh at me. They'll laugh at me or whatever. Right?
Absolutely.
And
Mhm. No, go ahead. Go on, Rosendo. Rosendo. I cut you off.
yeah, but it makes it easier for them to like to open up and for the teacher whatever
Absolutely.
they need.
Yeah, it's easier for them to open up. It takes a lot of that pressure. They don't have to worry about, did I spell it wrong? I mean, how many students are just not going to put anything into the chat because they're worried they're going to spell it wrong? Or, oh, I put the wrong word. Oh, I translated that incorrectly. Oh, my grammar's off. It kind of takes away that pressure. So I'm not just talking about this for your lesson we're going to be teaching to your peers or teaching to step 1 or step 2 students. This is really also when moving into the future, if you're going to be teaching a class of students, you have some English learners or students who aren't as comfortable, it gives them more time and it takes a little bit of pressure off. Now, when do we use the public chat and when do we use the private chat? So I want you to sort of think what questions might be better for a public chat and what questions might be better for a private chat. Because you don't necessarily want to do everything in the public chat and you don't want to necessarily do everything in the private chat. There's going to be some questions that are sort of better for each one. So who has an idea? What would be better for public and what would be better for private?
Maybe like when we first started, when you asked, oh, do you think the dinosaur can crush the Jeep? Like yes or no questions, simple questions like those
Simple,
for the
easy,
public.
everybody can answer. What did I ask you when I asked you for the private chat? What kind of question was that? Was that a simple, easy yes or no?
I think it was a more critical thinking question where you had to actually like take a second and like pay attention by yourself, because if you have that, like I said, if you have that in the public chat, then somebody is just going to go based off of what somebody else says, or they're going to be like, yeah, I agree with this person, instead of
Right.
thinking themselves.
Exactly. That's the other danger with the public chat. It's like, oh, I'll just wait for their answer and then I'll just copy that answer. Exactly. So generally speaking, when you have sort of an easy, simple opinion or something like that question, that's really great for public chat. Let's just get their ideas out. And then when it gets to the harder stuff, the more critical thinking, or we want to see can each student do it independently, that might be where the private chat is a little bit more efficient. Now, notice, do I only use chat? Or what else do I do? Do I only use chat? Do I only use verbal? What have I been doing in this lesson?
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both. Why
Sometimes
a little bit of both, Esther? Why do I not want to just do chat? Why do I not want to just do verbal?
I think like with the chat, it's kind of like what Marita said. They won't be paying attention, so you don't know if they really are or not. They'll just answer whatever someone else says. So that way you kind of catch them off guard sometimes when you ask them to speak, and so that way you know that they're actually paying attention.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the nice thing about the chat is the chat's kind of democratic. So if I ask a question to the class and I only rely on verbal responses, who's going to answer my questions if I just do verbal?
I think some like only a certain amount of students, because I know sometimes that happens in our college classes too. Like there's only one or two people that keep talking and they're the only ones because nobody else wants to answer.
That kid, right? It's that kid. It's going to be the same in person and the same online. If you just go with the verbal, it's pretty much that kid who's always answering. It's like, all right, I'll do it, teacher. And so with the chat, it's this more democratic. We get everybody involved. We get everybody thinking. We get everyone responding. But if we only go with the chat, like you said, Esther, like you said, Maritza, maybe they're just copying what other people are saying. Maybe they're just not putting anything into the chat. But also, how is your lesson going to feel? Like, just thinking from the perspective of a teacher who's trying to teach an inquiry based lesson, how does it feel if everything is just happening in the chat?
Boring.
Why boring?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. So
Why would you say boring? And I agree with you.
I think it would be boring just because you don't really, like, you have to pay attention, but you're not really doing much. So like the kids are they're, even if they have their cameras on, they're not going to be paying attention. They're going to be looking at something else, and they're just like, okay, it's time for us to reply. Everyone else is replying. Let me just put something in there.
Exactly. The engagement level is super low, and it's you can tell in the classes where it's just like, all right, we're just doing this. Let's just get through it. If you want that high engagement, it's good to have a little bit of both. Start with the chat, get everybody thinking, and then follow up with that discussion. And that's really a good pattern to have. I'll chat, we'll discuss. We'll chat, we'll discuss. And it kind of keeps everybody a little bit more engaged. And also, the discussion is really great for those in depth, let's ask some follow up questions. Not so great for the chat. And, it kind of slows you down. You're sort of waiting. All right, let's wait. Next question. All right, let's wait. So, if you want to have more of that conversation, that's really good for the verbal. So, my big recommendation for all of you is have a mix. Have a mix, and that's really going to be the best kind of lesson. Public chat, private chat, calling on people randomly, letting people, just speak up, just like you would in a normal classroom, having a nice mix of strategies. Okay, so now what we're going to do, and I'm totally going to go over, I always do, okay, is we're actually going to get to that activity. Remember, we have that activity? All right, so with the activity, I'm going to walk you through it, and I'm going to let you do it, but I also kind of want to talk a lot about how I set it up, because this is going to be important if you want to set up a similar activity with your students. So what I have here is your classic card sort. So imagine I took any sort of manipulative that you would have, physical manipulative, and I just made a digital version. And how did I do that? I just copied images, or I took screenshots of images, and you can do that as long as you remember to cite where you got your resources from. So what I have here is I have a slide, and it has my tasks. And I broke up my tasks into little task cards. So I have task 1, task 2, task 3. This is going to be beneficial for your students because that way they don't have to wait, what was that first set of instructions? What am I supposed to do? It's like I took my worksheet, my handout where I would have written out the instructions, and I put them in little task cards, so that way the students can go back to them. So my first task is task number 1, place the animals in order from least to greatest bite force. So if I lift up this task card, or if I delete the task card, which I could do, but I'm not going to right now, behind it is my cards. So these are my cards, and here we have some animals, and I can pull them out, and I can drag and drop them. So I can determine, all right, well, where am I going to put that crocodile? Am I going to put it, more bite force than the sheep, less than the sheep? Where am I going to put the pit bull? And so I can move them around the screen anywhere you like. You can also make them bigger. If you want to like, ooh, let me look at those teeth a little bit more. Or you can make them smaller if you're like, you know what, I need more space to fit everything. So basically you have these cards and you can manipulate them. And you're going to put them from least to greatest. And I will say they won't all fit on one line, so you might need more than one line, and you can go through and organize the cards. Now, a couple of notes about this. I created this whole thing in PowerPoint. You are welcome to do so. I like to create in PowerPoint just because I'm comfortable with the program. I know a lot of the bells and whistles. So you could send to each student their own PowerPoint. They could download it, and then they could work on it. Or you could do it on a Google slide right now. So the nice thing about PowerPoint is you can upload your PowerPoints to Google Slide, and it will automatically turn your PowerPoint into a Google slide, or vice versa. You could have a Google slide and then just save it as a PowerPoint. They're completely compatible with each other. So whichever program you just feel more comfortable, that's the one I would start with. So with the PowerPoint, I could have everyone download a copy and work on it on their own and share their screen. With the Google Slide, I actually have access to all your copies. So I could see each individual student's copy and have them work on it. Or in this case, what I can do is I actually made multiple copies. So I can have group 1 here, group 2 here, group 3 here, and I can see everybody at once. So I kind of have like eagle eyes on the whole class. There's benefits to all 3. It kind of just depends on how you want to set up the lesson, and we can talk about why you might want to do one over the other. But so that's pretty much how I set this up. So right now, you should all have access if you go to your Google Classroom. I'm going to put all these back. So if I go to but one last thing I would recommend, when you make these, keep an unedited version for yourself that the students won't play with, because, then they'll move around all your slides. So, always have your original. Okay, so if you go into the classroom, you can click on the Bite Force demo lesson. You will have access to this. And I also put the link into the chat if you need it. So what we're going to do is, just for the sake of time, I'm going to just have you all work as one big group instead of multiple groups. And again, that can vary depending on how many students you're going to have in your class and what activities you want them to do. Do you want them to do it independently, in groups of 2, groups of 3, groups of 4, etc. So at this point, I will let you all take over and sort the cards in any order you think is correct. Again, this is just a prediction of least to greatest bite force. So, go.
We only do the task 1, right?
Correct, yes. So that's why I have these ones sort of in a separate column for when we get to those tasks. You could put them on separate slides. I chose to put them on the same slide. You'll see why in just a little bit. So if I were to have multiple groups, I have on page 4, you can see I actually have a sort of an instructions, like group 1 would be on slide 4, group 2 would be on slide 5, group 3 would be on slide 6, etc. So you can direct people to different slides if you are so inclined. But for right now, we'll just have everybody work on slide 5 and put your little organisms in the order that you think they should go. And feel free to talk to each other. Another quick note is if I was going to have students in a breakout room doing this, I would probably also assign tasks. So I would have one person in charge of sharing their screen and moving the little slides. I would have one person being the reporter who's going to have the job of reporting back how they figured out which one they put where. And then I probably would have somebody as a timekeeper. And so those are usually three pretty good tasks: reporter, recorder, and timekeeper, to make sure that the students are focused and doing the activities as they should be. And then you as a teacher, you can look at the different slides. This is the benefit of having all of them in one document. And I can say, okay, group one, they're working, they're doing good. Group two, oh, they haven't even gotten started. I should probably go check in on that group, etc. And so you can sort of have eagle eyes on the class. You could also do this if everyone has a separate Google slide. It's just you'd have to pull up each individual window. If everybody downloads it as a PowerPoint, you wouldn't be able to see what they're working on unless you ask them to share their screen. So again, how you set it up kind of depends on, as a teacher, what access and what you want to be able to see.
So we're all working on the same exact slide, right? That one that you're
Exactly,
presenting,
yeah.
right?
For the sake of time, I'm having you all work on the same slide. Normally, I would have you work in groups or independently on this. The danger of having everybody work on the same slide is if they're not communicating, like you move one thing over here, they move one thing over there. So that's why sometimes you don't want to have one slide for everybody. That's why sometimes you want to set it up so that each individual person gets their own slide so they can work without somebody messing up their slide, or have a group slide and have different groups. So again, there's positives and negatives to how you set it up each way. Kind of depends on what you want the students to be able to do, and also depends on how many students you're going to be talking about. Some of you are not going to have a lot of students in your room. Some of you will have a lot. They're going to sign up for times that they like. So, you might have like 8 students in your room. You could do groups. You might have 3 students in your room. Maybe you don't want to do groups in that case, or maybe have them work all together. So it's also going to vary depending on how many students are in your room. Okay, so I'm seeing crocodiles at the end. Crocodiles and alligators at the end. Why are we putting crocodiles and alligators at the end?
Because they bite really hard.
They bite really hard. That seems like a good reason. That's totally logical. I see rabbit over here. Why is rabbit over here at the other end?
Oh, I put it there because I mean, I've never been bitten by a rabbit, but I can imagine like they're so small, so I don't think their bite would do much harm.
Okay, so you're like, rabbits probably not. So A, they're just small animals, and B, maybe their bite isn't that tough. Okay, but who's got some other answers for why they're putting organisms in specific places? Rosenda, which one are you working on right now?
The thing is, right now I'm downloading my Google Slides and I'm having trouble. Like
Oh,
I
you're having
haven't
trouble
like
getting
been
in
able.
there? Yeah, and that's another
Yeah,
thing. You have
but
to have some technical issues. Let's see.
yeah, but I
Marisa,
would think that
oh, go ahead.
yeah, sorry. I would think that the hippo and the bear have like some of the biggest, like the most bite force rate.
Okay, so maybe hippos and
Yeah, the
bears.
hippo and the bear
And why might they have some good
and the
bite force?
shark maybe.
Maybe sharks.
Well, because like their head is bigger, their muscles are, I'm pretty sure, bigger, right? And they're um more like the muscle fibers are way bigger, right? Way stronger.
Okay, so we're definitely talking about head size, right? So we talked about the bunny has a small head size, hippos, bears, big head size. Maritza, what are you using to figure this out? How are you kind of evaluating which one would be larger, which would be smaller?
Well, I know the first two that they put down. I'm not touching the screen right now because I don't want to mess somebody up. But the first two that they put down, obviously because of the article that we had read. I do believe though that I think maybe um hippos bites might be stronger than shark bites, but I'm not sure. But
Not
I
sure.
feel
You're
like
gonna
they
see.
would.
Okay. Yeah, and they did mention in the article about the crocodiles and the alligators having very strong bites. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I can't believe it's already 4:28. I'm like, what? How did that happen? Oh my goodness. Okay, so I'm going to have to rush because we got a lot to cover and we're almost out of time. My apologies. So here's the thing. I would allow the students to do this activity where they sort things around. So here's the cool thing. Even though you're digital, you can still make your manipulatives and hands-on activities for your students. And it's actually pretty easy. Like I said, you find some images, you can have the students move them around. You can do this with math. You could say, okay, on this side, put everything that has an angle above 180. On this side, put everything below 180. We can do this with biology. Here's a DNA strand. Here I have sort of a collection Like, remember how we had the cards stacked on each other of adenines, thymines, guanines, and cytosines, and I want you to pair them up where they would go, and so they could drag and drop that way. With physics, we could say something along the lines of, okay, here I have 4 different surfaces. I want you to rank them in order you think they would be from highest to lowest of friction. So, there's a lot that you can do with these drag and drops that are very easy to create, and the students can manipulate them, move them around, and start looking for patterns, start making, forming groups in their minds of how they're related. So moving on to task 2, now here's a really cool extra little hack that you can do with your cards. So if I were to delete task 2, then it says, now I want the answers. So imagine I have these physical cards. I could actually put on the back of the card the actual bite force, right? And you could flip it over and see who has the highest bite force and then actually arrange them based off of that. I can't do that right here, right? I can't like flip over a card. I mean, I could, but it would probably be kind of difficult to program that. So here's my little hack. So with Google Slides or with PowerPoint, you can do it with either. You can't do it with Jamboard. So if you like Jamboard, just realize Jamboard is a little limited in some of the functions that it can do compared to Google Slides and PowerPoint. Is I can right click and I can click right here where it says Alt Text. See right there, Alt Text. And if I click on Alt Text, it gives me the name of the card. So this is a grizzly bear. Okay. And it also gives me the bite force. And I also put this other information, where it's found and what it eats. So I can add additional information with the alt text. So now when I ask the students, okay, rearrange the cards based off who has the greatest and the least bite force, now they can use the alt text to figure that out. And they can use this additional information to see if that can answer those questions of why certain organisms have higher or lower bite force. So alt text is your friend. That can be a lot of fun. And again, I hid that task 2 card. It's there, but I hid it until I was ready for the students to get to it. And so now they can do that and they can look for patterns of why certain organisms have higher or lower bite forces. And some of them are going to actually be pretty surprising. So that little cute bunny rabbit that you're like, don't worry about him. Yeah, he actually has 400 psi as a bite force. That could hurt. That's pounds per square inch. So yes, not as much as an alligator or a crocodile, but still enough to do some damage. So, you can have them look at that and sort of sort them and figure out what's going on there. With task number 3, so I'll delete my task number 3, now I could have you put a human on here. And I could say, okay, so now place the human where you think the human would go based off what you've discovered. And then again, with the alt text, they could see, okay, did I get the human? So the human 162 approximately bite force. So actually less, is it less than the bunny? I think it is less than the bunny, right? Is the bunny? Yeah, actually less than a bunny. So a bunny has more bite force than a person. I bet you did not expect that.
Yeah, the bunny almost beats the tiger. The tiger, it's like for something, right?
Let's see. Do I have tiger on here? I don't, but I have jaguar. Let's see what the jaguar has. The jaguar. Oh no, the jaguar is 1,500. So that's definitely more than the bunny. But those bunnies, they can hurt when they bite. And so then we would try to come up with why. Well, why does a bunny have so much more psi than a human? Right? That shouldn't be right. They're smaller. They have smaller craniums. Why do they have so much more bite force? And we could try to answer that question. So just again, going through here, very easy to set up. And again, I set it up once, and then I can copy it for every group, or I could copy it for every student by giving them their own version or having Google Classroom create a version for every student. So easy to set up. And if you need help or have questions about how to do any of this, feel free to ask. Like I said, I'm rushing through it. So then what I would have the students do is I would have them figure out, well, why? Why do bunny rabbits have these like crazy bite forces? And that actually comes to going to our physics, that this bite force is actually not a measure of force, it's a measure of pressure. When I look at pressure, pressure is the force, but what's that other missing variable? What's that missing variable? That would
Over area.
Area. So it's not just how much force you can produce, it's the amount of force you can produce in a given area. Why does that matter? I want you to think about a bunny rabbit's teeth. How do they look? Anyone know how their bunny rabbit's teeth look?
It's just like two, right? Two teeth in the
Yeah,
front.
so they have the two front ones and they're very thin. So you'd be like, well, they're thin. That shouldn't produce a lot of force. But remember, we're putting all of that force in a very thin area. So my math people, if my area, if my denominator is small, what's that going to do to my pressure?
It could be bigger. The
It's gonna
pressure.
increase it.
It increases the pressure. So that's why the carnivores have those very pointy teeth. We're putting all that pressure in one teeny tiny area. So that way we increase the pressure versus herbivores, which tend to have flat teeth. And so you would spread it out amongst that area. So that would be basically how they would figure that out. We kind of went through that really fast. But just for those of you who want to know, these are also pictures of how they measure bite force. I love this one right here. We got the little lizard. We're making him bite down. It's pretty cute. Okay, so anyways, so now another source that I want to show you is, this is a website called Digimorph. And so with Digimorph, it's from the University of Boston. What they did is they took CT scans of a bunch of skulls of different animals. And here I have a camel, and here I have a crocodile. And on the Google slide, I tell you, the camel's about 400 psi, about the same as that bunny rabbit, and the crocodile is 4,000 psi, so significantly larger. And so what I could have my students do to answer that question, well, why is the crocodile so much more than the camel, is with Digimorph, they could actually go here and it will show them, and they can move around the skulls, and they can look at the teeth, and they can look at them from different angles, and they can sort of see, oh, okay, the flat teeth versus the pointed teeth. So this would be an example of how you can use different websites to also engage your students. So this is a great one for this lesson, but other ones that are great are things like PhET simulations. They've got some for math, chemistry, physics, and biology. If you're going to do a bio lesson, the HHMI biointeractives are fantastic. They have some really good ones. And for math, I would highly recommend using, oh, I'm blanking on it. It's a digital calculator. That's really great. Help me out. What's the name of that digital calculator? Desmos. Desmos is fantastic. And if you're working with Miss Mendiola, she absolutely loves Desmos. And so you can go check out Desmos and that. So this is, again, another resource you can use, is going to a website and having a simulation kind of help engage the students and have them play around with those and work with those. Okay. And then finally, the last thing that I have here is sort of how could we elaborate, how could we extend this lesson? So for my biology students, we could talk about it in terms of evolution, in terms of taxonomy or relationship, extinct versus extant species. How can we figure out who's related to who based off of bite force, based off of the teeth and the cranium? We could look at predator and prey relationships, carnivores, herbivores, and omnivores, defense mechanisms. We could look at anatomy, looking at the bones and the muscles involved. For my physics students, we could look at pressure, and we could actually measure flat teeth versus pointed teeth and look at how that makes a difference in PSI. We could have them convert to newtons and look at force in newtons. And we could also maybe do acceleration, have them use the acceleration formula to figure out how much acceleration are you utilizing when you clamp down and when you bite. For my math students, you could look at ratios. So somebody mentioned about small heads versus big heads. That is a great point. What if we looked at the bite force quotient, which is you take the ratio of bite force to head size? Would that make a difference? Would we see them in the same order? So they could look at ratios, or we could look at graphs. There's a ton of graphs of bite force, and they could analyze the graphs looking at how the bite force changes for different organisms with different size skulls, or different size teeth, or different organisms and things of that nature. So those are all extensions that you could do for each lesson. Okay, so that was a super rushed version at the end, but hopefully enough to kind of get your mind thinking, oh, wow, there are quite a few things I could do online that are pretty cool. I can use Zoom features like share screen and annotate, public chat and private chat. I can have students unmute their microphones and communicate and talk. I could use breakout rooms. We didn't get to breakout rooms today, but I could have students work in groups and discuss with each other in breakout rooms. You could use PowerPoint and Google Slides and Google Classroom to create resources for your students and keep them all in one place. And then you can have an idea of what students are looking at and kind of keep an eye on them while they're doing these activities. You can make activities that are completely hands-on, where students can move and manipulate things around, and you can use that alt text to provide additional information that maybe you don't want them to see right away. Same thing with the task cards. So that was a lot crammed into one lesson, but like I said, not everything. There's so much more that you can do, and that is where we want you and your partner and your master teacher to brainstorm and have fun coming up with these virtual lessons. So I hope this was helpful to you. And like I said, if you have any questions or want to know more, feel free to ask.